Hello, thank you, KCIW listeners, and thank you to our volunteers, our coordinators, everyone who devotes their time to produce this radio program and the entire radio station. It is fully run from volunteers, and we love all the effort that comes through. It is really remarkable. We are so grateful. And if you are not sure how to participate and you want to be one of the sponsors, volunteers, or coordinators, give a call to 541-661-4098. I'm Amanda Whittemore. We are here on the Quality Living with Peaceful Support program. And as you may imagine, this is a show where we do exactly that. We give a couple of minutes, about 20-ish, 25 or so, solid, devoted minutes to actually listen and hear to really important activities and or issues or ways to find solutions within our community. And tonight we have a really important guest, as they all are. However, this is a super moment of almost urgency. So we just jumped on as quick as we could. And we have Mr. Jeremy Rogers with us. And Jeremy is actually the General Counsel for Oregon Realtors. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, how are you?
Doing lovely. Thank you so much for taking a time out of your busy schedule with all the activities that you do.
Of course. No, thanks so much for reaching out and engaging with us on this. I'm really glad for the opportunity to tell more folks about what's happening and hopefully get folks to engage.
Yes. Participation is where it's at. And thankfully, our listeners are pretty active. And even if they are not sure how to get in touch with us through the call-in phone number, we always have the email contact@kciw.org. And they can even reach Jeremy Rogers directly. We'll give our listeners all that information. But first, let's hear about who is Jeremy and what is Jeremy doing? What is this General Counsel for Oregon Realtors about? And what other titles do you have?
Hey, thanks so much. Well, so I'm a General Counsel and the Government Affairs Director at Oregon Realtors. Oregon Realtors is the statewide trade association for real estate professionals in Oregon. So anyone who's ever bought or sold a house most likely worked with somebody who is a member of the Oregon Realtors. And I also, and relevant to the topic today, am the board president of an organization called Oregonians for Floodplain Protection, which consists of business groups, cities, counties, and property owners from across Oregon who are very concerned about a new plan that FEMA has for the National Flood Insurance Program in Oregon that would severely restrict what type of development people could do with their properties.
And has this plan been enacted in any other states?
No, this is an Oregon-only plan.
That's a little concerning.
Yeah, it is. There's actually temporary rules in effect right now that Oregon communities so most Oregon communities already are having to live with some of these rules as they then finalize the final plan. And that's where there's an opportunity right now for folks to comment on that. But this all came from a lawsuit from environmental groups back in 2009, where they sued FEMA regarding FEMA's implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program, specifically in Oregon, claiming that the National Flood Insurance Program was causing development in floodplains, and then that development was harming endangered fish. And as a result, FEMA settled that lawsuit with the environmental groups and is developing this plan to implement in Oregon that would dramatically reshape what the development standards are for the NFIP here. And if communities don't comply with it, they would be kicked out of the program, meaning that citizens and businesses in the jurisdictions and, in the cities and counties across Oregon that have floodplains and that are part of the National Flood Insurance Program would no longer be able to get federal flood insurance, and which means they would no longer be able to receive disaster assistance from the federal government if there was a flood disaster, and also would not be able to get federally backed mortgages because those mortgages require access to flood insurance.
Holy goodness. Does this have anything to do when there was a big controversy with the Smith River, the Wild Rivers organization, a nonprofit that had something to do with FEMA? And I don't have all the exact information. I had a guest that was on the show, and it's kind of like sparking some memory. I'll have to revisit that show.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they specifically were involved. The original lawsuit that sparked this all came from the Audubon Society
Hmm.
back in 2009. And then there's been some other sort of statewide and national environmental groups, but I'm not familiar with the involvement of that particular group.
Okay. Yeah, just, there's so much that happens in the state of Oregon, in protecting our rights and protecting our ability to receive relief when there's a disaster, I think is a pretty important one.
Yeah, no, it's critical. There's about 260 communities across Oregon that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and those span across 31 of 36 Oregon counties. And really, you have some communities where a significant portion of their developable land, whether that be existing housing and commercial areas or the areas available for future development, are in the 100-year floodplain.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a base, based on the geography and topography of the region that they're located in. And so this plan has really severe consequences for those communities. And then also, you have some communities where maybe only a small portion of their developable land is in the floodplain, but that portion is significant. For example, in the Portland area, the Portland Harbor, which they call the working waterfront, where is really one of the larger sources of industrial jobs in the region. And a lot of jobs that pay very high wages, but only require, or that don't require a college degree, are available there. And so this would have significant impacts, really, both for the small communities where they have a lot of land in the floodplain, and even for the largest communities where they don't, but have significant activities going on there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is just really beyond unique, like you mentioned, critical. And how can our listeners get more information? We're going to give them as much as we can in the next 15 minutes here. However, we really want to be able to plug them with hands-on activities and or ability to do their own research.
Yeah, so what I would recommend is if you go to the website for Oregonians for Floodplain Protection, which is floodplainprotection.org. On that website, you'll be able to read about FEMA's plan. You'll be able to access summary materials that sort of describe some of the impacts. And also the links to comment are there. And FEMA is accepting public comment through Monday, October 6th, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time or 8:59 p.m. Pacific Time. And if it's okay, maybe I'll just explain a little bit more about the details of this plan so that folks can kind of comprehend, exactly what FEMA is asking of communities and property owners as they think about, whether they want to get more involved and submit some comments.
Yes.
So the basic idea that FEMA is proposing for changing the National Flood Insurance Program in Oregon, and maybe I'll just take a step back. Part of the sort of deal between local governments and the federal government to be part of the National Flood Insurance Program are development standards that the local governments must implement. Those development standards currently exist in federal rules that were adopted through nationwide notice and comment rulemaking decades ago. And all the communities across the U.S. that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program have to abide by those rules. The local governments adopt floodplain development ordinances that comply with those rules and issue floodplain permits. And they, in the process of doing that, if you're trying to add on to your house in the floodplain or build a house or build a commercial venue in the floodplain, you apply for those permits from your local government, and those will require you to comply with FEMA's rules, and then you get the permit. So what FEMA is doing here is sort of going around that federal notice and comment rulemaking process and creating this specific set of standards for Oregon that are just much more severe than what's required nationwide. And the crux of it is what they're calling no net loss. Um, and what they mean by that is what they've identified three functions of the floodplain. One function is what they call flood storage. So meaning if it does flood, where does the water go during the flood? And in particular here, where do the fish go during the flood? And so no net loss of flood storage means if you build anything in the floodplain, and in fact, if you store any equipment in the floodplain long term, because FEMA considers that as part of development in their definition of development, you would have to remove, and it's not even just an equal amount. The rules they're proposing would be a greater amount of material from the floodplain to ensure that there is no net loss of flood storage. So that would mean taking down a structure of a greater size than what you're building, or essentially digging a hole that takes up, that gives a place for the water to go. So, for example, they did what's called an environmental impact statement on their plan, and while that's called an environmental impact statement, it looks at both economic and environmental considerations, and that's what's sort of open for comment right now. They looked at some examples, and for example, they said that building a 1,500 square foot structure with a 20 by 40 foot driveway in the floodplain would require removing 6,800 cubic feet of soil from the floodplain and then depositing it outside the floodplain. What they also found was that probably would require a second lot. You probably wouldn't be able to do that on a single lot. So now anyone who was wanting to develop in the floodplain would essentially have to figure out how to obtain the second lot. And then that mitigation, that hole that's been dug, would have to remain there permanently. And there would have to be some way of guaranteeing that. And this all sounds so silly, but it's real. And I'm not, and I do want to say, we're not suggesting that there shouldn't be important protections in place to protect fish habitat, but there already are very strict floodplain development standards. You cannot do in the floodplain everything that you can do outside of the floodplain. There already are those standards, as well as many other efforts that the communities involved in the National Flood Insurance Program undertake to restore and protect fish habitat. What's being asked here with this no net loss is almost so absurd and costly that it essentially would lead to a prohibition on development, because it's unlikely that, sort of financially and economically speaking, people would really be able to comply with these regulations. One other example is, I talked about the sort of removal of material, because that's flood storage. So another function of the floodplain that they are looking at is water quality, and the way that they're measuring whether water quality has been impacted is if you add impervious surface. So if you add pavement to the floodplain, any type of material that does not allow water through. So you'd have to remove an equivalent amount if you were to do that. So if you were to build a driveway in the floodplain, you would then have to, like a 20 by 40 foot driveway, they found you'd have to remove 4,600 square feet of other pavement from somewhere in the floodplain and deposit it outside of the floodplain. With the third one is around vegetation. If you remove vegetation, that would have to be replaced. And particularly, they have requirements in there around trees. And depending on how close you are to the water body and how large the tree is, the replacement ratios for trees range up up to like 12 trees per one tree that is removed. That's not in all cases. There's other cases where it's more likely going to be 3, 4, 5, 6, but um, those are those no net loss standards, which again really are going even further than no net loss. What they found was that for folks to comply with these standards, the cost of construction for homes and commercial structures would likely increase by close to 30%. And to put that into more relatable terms, the cost of a mortgage on a typical new home would increase by more than $7,500 a year to account for the increased cost of purchasing that home based on the construction cost of the home. We're in the midst of a housing crisis. And as I mentioned, there are communities, particularly many coastal communities, where the land they currently have available for new housing development is in the floodplain. And in fact, FEMA found over the last, was it 15 years, I think, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the housing units in Oregon were built in the floodplain. We are we are woefully behind in our housing production goals. I think the governor set a goal of 36,000 units per year to catch up to where we need to be, given the deficit of housing units we have. And we're operating like way less than even half of that right now. And so this is just another blow to the ability to meet our state's housing goals, along with economic development and other important priorities.
Listeners, we are talking with Jeremy Rogers, and he is updating us on a critical issue about the floodplain. Say it again for me, Jeremy.
So these are the new floodplain development standards that FEMA is requiring in order for communities to remain in the National Flood Insurance Program.
And that's a pretty big deal. As Jeremy pointed out in this show, that the majority of Oregon is in that zone, and we do need new houses in our area. And for those who are looking to build new houses and or developments, would you say it would make it nearly impossible because of their requirements, or just out of price us?
Well, the thing is if something's not, if people can't afford something, it's not going to be built, because developers only build things that people are likely to buy, because otherwise they'll be stuck with a house that they're underwater on, right?
Yeah,
And so,
literally.
yeah, so, I mean, certainly you could imagine maybe there's some people who are building their own home and have lots of have means, and they're willing to accept a 30% or more increase in cost. But for development that is going to be sold to others, it's hard to imagine, because most people are already so cost burdened that they can barely afford something. So if you're going to increase the cost of it by 30%, the number of people who are able to afford that goes down so much. The incentive for a developer to be able to build something also really goes down. And you also, as we talked about before, FEMA is saying you likely would need a second lot to do the mitigation on, which means you're halving the number of lots that are available for development.
Oh, wow.
Which will also have an impact, right? Because everyone's going to need a second one to do the mitigation on.
That's wild.
Yeah. So I think, for most, for most people, this is going to essentially be a de facto bar on development, because the costs just aren't going to justify the work, that the development that would be done.
Right. And our listeners can make public comments to FEMA directly at floodplainprotection.org. Is that correct?
So if you go to floodplainprotection.org, that is the website for our coalition, which is called Oregonians for Floodplain Protection. On it, you will find a link to submit comments. You'll also find more information, summary information about the plan, and some materials that can help you develop comments. And we even have a link on there. If you're not sure what to say, we have a link on there that you can click that will pull up an email and include some comments, and then you can customize that for for your own particular things that you want to say.
Is there a direct phone number, or is it mostly an online activity?
It's online via email, as well as via like a Google form they have, and we have links to both of those on the website. You can also mail in comments, but at this point, given the deadline's Monday, that's probably, and fax. If anyone has a fax, they do have a fax number that you can comment.
Yes, we love fax numbers.
The email and the Google form are probably going to be the best ways to do that. And then I should mention, so FEMA has come out with this plan, and I mentioned they came out with what they call the draft environmental impact statement, and that's what they're taking comments on. And as part of that, they presented 3 alternatives. So 2 of the alternatives, which are alternative 2 and alternative 3, are just variations on what I have described to you so far in this interview. This no net loss standard. Mm-hmm. Alternative 1 is what they call the no action alternative, which means the NFIP would remain in Oregon as we know it, subject to the national standards, not with these Oregon specific no net loss standards. So we're encouraging folks who are concerned about this to include in their comments that alternative 1 is their preferred alternative.
Okay. And just so listeners have an idea, how exactly did you get involved with this organization exactly?
Yeah, so as although actually it's interesting, I even before I worked at Oregon Realtors, I actually did my this has been going on for a long time. I mentioned that the lawsuit from the environmental groups was in 2009.
Yeah.
I actually did my law school capstone paper at Lewis and Clark Law School on this topic, interestingly. But then when I became to work at Oregon Realtors, this is so critical for as a real estate issue, and for our members, and for their clients and communities that want to have homes that are developed and that want to be able to add on to their homes, and that want to have thriving downtowns and communities. And some of those downtowns in these coastal areas in particular, they're in the floodplain.
Right.
And so it's a big deal for our membership. We have about 18,000 members statewide. And so actually Oregonians for Floodplain Protection formed back in 2017 with several, as I mentioned, several different business groups and local jurisdictions that are concerned about this, to file a lawsuit against FEMA, trying to stop this. And that case was dismissed because the judge basically said, well, hey, FEMA hasn't actually required the local communities to do anything yet. So come back once, you're at that point. And then I mentioned FEMA implemented some temporary measures that are essentially requiring this no net loss starting at the end of last year. And then they're finalizing their final plan. And that's what we're talking about today. We brought back that lawsuit in January of this year. So while right now we're focused on this comment period and trying to raise awareness and get people to comment, there's also a federal lawsuit going on that includes Oregonians for Floodplain Protection, and that we at Oregon Realtors are very involved in trying to stop this as well.
And I think it's interesting. The most interesting thing I learned from you was that Oregon is the only state this is happening in, and there's floodplains across the United States.
Yeah, and it's been a strategy of environmental groups to sue in a specific state, claiming that the NFIP implementation is that, and that state is harming the species that are located in that state. There's a couple other states where they've done this and that are at sort of various points in the process. But that's the sort of strategy, is rather than try to address this at a national level through legislation or through rulemaking, just suing in individual states and trying to force, essentially turning the NFIP into a habitat protection program rather than an insurance program, and a program to mitigate risk to people and property.
Right, and affecting our housing and how it all pertains to each county and individual and our mortgage rates and all these really important things that anyone looking into purchasing a house or buying a house, it's going to affect everybody in the big picture.
Yep.
Phenomenal, just legislation after legislation, and the best way, like, for listeners, like, we can't really, what we do is we provide information, and you guys out there make your own decisions, decide to copy this link, send it to your friends and family or other people in Oregon or in somewhere in the world. And you don't have to, but we encourage everybody to participate as much as possible for creating the world of quality with peaceful support that you choose to live in. And Jeremy, we really thank you for having this moment to get online, get on the radio show with us. It is an online show, but get on the program with us and just give some proper information with these links, and remind our listeners one more time where they can get this contact information.
Yeah, and thank you again. I am really grateful for the opportunity to speak to you and to your audience. And for more information, folks can go to floodplainprotection.org. floodplainprotection.org.
Perfect. Thank you so kindly for participating. And you can always call me, listeners, if you need any more info. And thank you, Jeremy. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.